Okay, so we are live with our debate. So I've got a little prepared background for this for folks so they know what we're talking about. Um, I made this debate at Yazan's suggestion based on a Facebook post of a Twitter tweet. The tweet was tagged as Pound Church 2, which was part of a campaign to highlight the fact that sexual abuse and harassment can take place inside religious institutions. The tweet in question reads as follows, quote, I was raped when I was 9 by a member of my church. The pastor and my parents told me I needed to forgive him, as that is what Jesus would do. They made me hug my rapist and tell him that I forgive him, end quote. So Yazan was interested in a debate about this question with a focus on the value of forgiveness in Christian teaching, whether there were any pastors who kind of supported this viewpoint, that sort of thing, and people who were against it. I didn't say specifically, but I thought it was an interesting topic. So we'll use it as a starting point for the debate. I don't want to discuss this particular tweet the whole time. Hopefully, it's kind of a pretty sad claim if true. We don't know 100%. I'm not going to judge one way or another. It may well be, or it may not be. But regardless, I think the principle underlying it is kind of what we want to talk about today. So I'm interested in kind of exploring what forgiveness means and what it means within the context of Christianity, and then kind of how far should you take it. So should I start on commentary, or would you like to start with that?
You can start. It's fine.
Okay, so I'll talk about the tweet itself, since that was kind of the original jumping off point. Horrible story. I mean, absolutely tragic in my view. It sounds maybe like these people were trying to protect the church. If I had to guess, I would say she was part of some slightly cult-like religious group, at least in mentality. It sounds that way to me. They tend to be very protective of themselves and their members, don't like outside interference. And so I would suspect this is not a mainstream or normal Christian view at all. Most Christians I know would be just as horrified as I am about it. That said, I do think it is possible for somebody to forgive a rapist. I don't think that's outside the realm of possibility, nor would it necessarily be a bad act to do so. I think it might actually have value. However, I think a 9-year-old is not capable of understanding what it takes to forgive an act like that, or even the full implication and meaning of what happened to them. So I think it's utterly inappropriate to demand or ask or cajole a 9-year-old into that kind of activity because of her age. Also, I think that while Jesus does encourage us to tolerate our persecutors and love our enemies, that's Jesus, so that's kind of an encouragement. It's not necessarily what every human being has to do, even if they want to be a Christian. I think it's good to try and follow Jesus's examples, but I don't think we can all expect of ourselves to have the same outlook as a divine person. So I think that's a little bit difficult. I don't go so far as Jesus does. Generally, I'm a secular person. I'm not a Christian, but I do read the Bible, and I think Jesus's teachings are very interesting, and I studied them, and I think they have a lot of value. But I can't go as far as he did in terms of turning the other cheek and loving my enemy. I'm not sure I'm quite up for that level of grace, as the case may be. But I do put a lot of value in forgiveness. And the last element of the story that I think is problematic is, asking someone to hug their rapist, I think is only encouraging the rapist and empowering them, and very dangerous kind of attitude. So that detail of the story is perhaps the most egregious and has no value. Even if you're going to forgive somebody, there's no reason to go having little girls hug pedophiles. It's terrible. So that's my take on the tweet and kind of my starting point for forgiveness, which is I think forgiveness, but not in these circumstances.
Okay. So I guess my first thought is that, yeah, I absolutely agree with you that most Christians are and should be horrified at what happened, according to this tweet. Yeah, I definitely think it's a cult-like group. And unfortunately, I'm kind of familiar with that subculture. I never went to a church that was quite that bad, but I was homeschooled growing up, and my family kind of spanned the whole spectrum from super fundamentalist Baptist, eventually moving along to mainstream Baptist, more Calvinist Baptist, and eventually I became Presbyterian in college. I still consider myself, I guess, technically what falls within evangelical, but I have a lot of departures from my upbringing for sure, especially on that issue. So I do think, as a matter of fact, like I think I am a social conservative, but I think that rape culture is real. I think that it's a real problem, not just out in the general world, but in the church as well. And a part of that is, um, from the Christian viewpoint, when man fell, when he sinned, God cursed gender relations, especially when it comes to men and abuse of power. It's something we see throughout history. And you know what they say about rape? It's not about sex, it's about power. So the thing about the church, about Christianity, is that people in church are broken as well. So it's not that we're supposed to expect people in church to be perfect. We're going to see the problems, but we should, as the church, when we see those problems, attempt to correct it. And that's what makes it so messed up. Like, there are times when no matter how many precautions you take, someone will do something horrible, like rape a 9-year-old. But that doesn't mean that we should tell that 9-year-old to hug her rapist and forgive him. And I think that's the particular problem with that subculture. It's conflation of forgiveness with reconciliation. The two aren't the same thing. So here's the thing about that. The Bible, very specifically in Deuteronomy, lays out civil law punishments for rapists, right? So that is never contradicted or passed out of so there are things in the Bible which Christ will change from the old covenant to the new. Like there are changes that are made doctrinally as the covenant expanded from the nation of Israel to the Gentiles as well. And that's not one of them. Rape is still considered a civil crime under biblical law, even in the New Testament. So there's no indication that that has changed. So it is our Christian duty, first and foremost, no matter what you believe about forgiveness, to bring that rapist to justice and to make him pay, make him go to jail. That is the Christian thing to do. Because when someone rapes someone, they're not just hurting the individual, they hurt the community and they're a danger to other people. In terms of what forgiveness means, what they force this 9-year-old girl to do is absolutely reckless in terms of how it puts her in danger of being raped again. So Jesus, when he was tempted by Satan, Satan told him to just throw yourself off the temple top, and the angels will not let you strike your foot. You know, they'll protect you from falling. But Jesus said to Satan, it is written, you shall not test the Lord your God. And I, as a Christian, take that to mean don't do intentionally stupid stuff in the name of God. It's disrespectful. So to have a 9-year-old hug her rapist, I think definitely falls under that. It's absolutely horrible what they made her do. And most importantly, it's not just her physical safety that's a problem. It's the whole fact that forgiveness is a process. It's not just this once and done magic word thing. It is a process because as Christians, we're going through this thing called sanctification. Over time, we're learning to become more like Christ, but we're not perfect. I think you pointed that out, right? Jesus is a role model for us, but we can't instantly be sinless the second we convert to Christianity. It is a journey, it's a process of being more like him and conforming to his example. So, first and foremost, in the immediate fallout of someone, especially a 9-year-old being raped, the Bible commands us to weep with those who weep and to mourn with those who mourn. And to literally make her hug her rapist is violating that command. So it's absolutely insensitive. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation because, like I said, reconciliation can be dangerous. Forgiveness, what it really means more than anything, is to let go of that expectation in your mind, that chip on your shoulder, that one day that person's going to get their comeuppance. Because I think we all know from experience that not everyone who wrongs us, as far as we can see in this life, will get what's coming to them. The whole idea with Christianity is that there's a hope with an afterlife, that if there's not justice here on this earth, there will be justice later, right? So we should make every effort to make justice happen here on this earth. But basically, not forgiving someone is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, right? So if this 9-year-old later down the road, in this process, right, she's showing signs of extreme distress and anger, if what has happened to her is becoming this unhealthy obsession that's consuming her from the inside out, at that point, it would be appropriate to step in and talk about forgiveness. But again, you have to be very careful with how you do that. Forgiveness is not saying the person who needs to forgive is the one who did something wrong. It's this process of realizing first that what happened to you, like you were wrong. There's so many people in the Christian community, they won't allow themselves to admit that they were wronged. because they think it's somehow a betrayal of their own faith. Like you said, it can be a cult-like group. You don't want to betray your church, right? You don't want to betray your own people. So you don't even really admit the rapist did something wrong to begin with. But that's the first step of forgiving. And then you've got to get to the point where you move past bargaining and the anger. You realize that nothing you ever do is going to erase that rape or that wrong that you've experienced in your life. And it is a process, especially for something as traumatic as rape. So I think there's a lot wrong that happens with this church, and there's a lot of groups, even within evangelical Christianity, who are working to fix it. There is this elder at a church I used to go to. His name's Boz Division. He works in this group called Grace. That's the acronym. They basically seek out people like Bill Gothard, who is behind this really cult-like group called ATI. He sexually assaulted and harassed his young teenage female co-workers, his secretaries, his underlings. So Boz does work like that, and also expose Bob Jones with how they mishandled rapes and stuff like that. So there are Christians who, like you said, we agree that this is a bad thing. We're trying to get it to stop. So sorry it took a while. That's just basically my primary response for now.
Sure. I think my role in this discussion is going to be a little more asking questions, occasionally providing my viewpoint. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, I mean, most Christian people I know, I'm not one. Maybe when I was younger, I was. When I was younger, I might have gone on and criticized people for their beliefs or challenged them, let's say, gone on my way. These days, I don't really do that. I defend my own views from time to time, and I enjoy discussing apologetics. But generally speaking, I am pro-religion. I'm pro for people seeking moral truth and living their lives according to a plan. And while there are some Christians I find extremely hypocritical and contrary to biblical teaching, as I'm sure other Christians find that as well, most of them that I've ever met are wonderfully nice people and have the best intentions. And I think most churches do good work and lead people in lives about considering their morality and paying attention to it, which I think is great. And the one thing that sometimes lacks from some non-religious people. Some people do. I try to self-examine pretty often, but not everybody else. Just depends. So I respect that, and yeah, I think most people would find it abhorrent. I've noticed two things that sometimes happen in churches. One, like you say, is insular self-protection. Right? You circle the wagons against anybody who might be a threat. That happens, and that leads to this kind of behavior sometimes. I think the other one is that people can be so embarrassed by these things and so disturbed by them that they try real hard to pretend they don't exist or that they haven't happened. And so in a way that they can't believe that this would happen in their church, and so therefore it didn't happen, right? And then that becomes one of the other avenues that these kinds of problems arise. I've had family members in those circumstances before, and they ended up having to leave their church and partly losing part of their faith because of that kind of event. But yeah, many people around them just would not believe or would not accept the truth of what had happened. And instead, whenever they bring it up, it's just very embarrassing, and they try to separate themselves, and people get ostracized and things like that. So, but mostly I'm kind of interested in forgiveness. I think the point about reconciliation is interesting in forgiveness. So I think generally when we think about forgiveness in a, let's say, a mundane circumstance, so I forgive you for being late to the party or something, had a date, somebody shows up late. We could either be angry and we kind of resent, or we could forgive. And generally, forgiveness is certainly the important part for us, or the great value, I think, is in the way it changes our feelings. We let go of the bitterness and anger, and we move on to other parts of our lives that are more productive, right? But I think there's also something in the person giving perhaps not complete absolution, but some portion of it, right? So I won't hold this against you. You don't owe me one. I forgive you. Right, you are forgiven. If we forgive somebody a debt, that means they don't have to pay it off anymore. If we, when we forgive things, generally there is a lessening of retributive action of some kind or another. I'm not going to say that it has to be absolute, but I think there is understood generally to be some part of that. But I would point out that there's a difference between the criminal justice system in society and a person's personal feelings about an event that happened. So a victim of rape, in many senses, unless they refuse to press charges, right, is not in control of the punishment of the rapist, right? once they've entered the criminal justice system to convert society, society could forgive them and commute their sentence, or the president or somebody like that. But generally speaking, that carries out on its own. So I don't think we would expect somebody who's a victim to be able to commute somebody's sentence, or not turn them in or something. However, I guess the question is what does, if somebody forgives a rapist, are we really giving them something, or is this something you could do on your own? I tend to think that you need two people together to really have forgiveness. You can let something go. You can create a kind of perhaps an apathy, or maybe, but I'm not sure if it's the full thing if you're not communicating it to somebody else. What do you think about that?
So a part of the reason I'm doing this right now, in addition to Eli being sick, is that we had a long discussion about this over dinner. I found out that he was doing this, and it's really interesting to me because I've got some personal experience with this, but also my minor at my in my evangelical Christian college was psychology, and actually the psychology program is absolutely fantastic. And one of my favorites was crisis intervention with Dr. Logan. He used to be the head of the department, really great professor. But one of the things we learned about was actually forgiveness and how that tied in with crisis intervention. And because it is a Christian school, we're using researched, evidence-based stuff, but we're tying in how that relates to Scripture as well from our particular worldview. And one of the really important points that was made in the course is that you can't always forgive somebody. Like, you can't always have two people present in a situation. For instance, just say 9/11, for instance, right? Okay, so if you have a relative who died in one of the towers of the Pentagon in 9/11, you can't reconcile with the hijackers on the plane because the hijackers are dead. Sometimes people have estranged relationships with their parents, and they may try to reconcile, but it literally doesn't happen, or it's not safe to try and reconcile. So I think that reconciliation definitely takes two people, but forgiveness doesn't. Forgiveness is really something that, especially from the Christian perspective, is one-sided. So, at least in Protestant theology, the idea is that we aren't saved by our works, but by our faith and by God's grace, right? God didn't have to send his son to die to take on all that punishment for us. So the whole idea is that we're unworthy, but God decided to reach down and do this for us anyway. So in Christian theology, forgiveness really is a one-sided thing. God forgives the unworthy, and that's what makes it so loving. Now, you pointed out, of course, that it is different. God is not, we're not the same as God. God has, he's the ultimate just person. He is the ultimate arbitrator of punishment rewards. So there is a huge difference there. We can't do that. But I would definitely say you don't need two people to do forgiveness. And this is also like a personal experience thing. I've had some people very near and dear to me who it happens in life. You're friends, and then you have a falling out, and you try to reach out to them to try and patch things up, and they just don't want it to happen. And you have to not only forgive them for what they've done to you without them ever kind of accepting you back into the fold, but you also have to learn to forgive yourself. So I think that really puts forgiveness as more of an internal process, right? Forgiveness is the whole concept, like I said, of there being a debt. I actually really, really love the Count of Monte Cristo. It's one of my favorite books. It's just absolutely incredible. I'm one of these people who has an issue with holding a chip on my shoulder. I can hold a grudge for years. It's a problem. It really is. Like, half the people I block on Facebook, I block because I don't want to obsessively be like, did something bad happen in their life? Like, I want to stop that impulse. It's really horrible. But so the thing is that in the Count of Monte Cristo, Edmond Dantes gets thrown in the Chateau d'If. His life is just completely wrecked, and then when he gets out, he decides to actively take every step he can to be his own personal avenger. And at the end of it, he finds that he's really, really empty, because it's like bargaining in the grieving process. If you're going to set out to try and make sure that you're going to undo everything, you're going to make everything the way it was before. Like, the fact is, you can't. It's bargaining, and you are grieving a loss. Like a 9-year-old girl who's been raped, I mean, she may not fully understand the concept of forgiveness, but she certainly understands that there's been a loss of something precious to her innocence. And the bargaining part, that can take a long time to overcome, which is why the church really should respect the command to weep with those who weep and mourn with those who mourn. It's going to take her time to do that. And it's really tragic that there's a whole subsection of Christianity that has been turning a blind eye to rape culture infiltrating the church. Like, that's a really huge problem. But yeah, real quick on self-protection and the embarrassment thing, especially, like, how could this happen in church? Yeah, I definitely agree. Some people even just they don't even call sexual harassment or assault that for what it is. When I was 9, I don't know if you remember fashion in the early 2000s, but you might recall that like girls would wear like these sparkly little tank tops, and then there would be kind of a cropped sweater over that tank top, and it might like
Oh yeah, I
yeah
remember
yeah.
that.
So like I was 8 years old. Okay, I'm 9 years old, and I'm wearing one of those at church with like my little modest skirt and whatever Baptist. Ooh. And this 16-year-old boy goes up to my mother and he says that you need to do something about your daughter's wardrobe because it accentuates my chest as an 8 or 9-year-old, right? Creepy as all heck.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't. My parents said like they did the right thing. They said, don't ever like comment on my daughter's body again, like stuff.
Makes
But
sense.
there were people we told. I think people knew about that in our church. They didn't really do anything about it. I don't think people knew how to respond because there is this chronic
Yeah.
problem in especially evangelical Christianity. It's the idea, like, we perverted the Christian gospel to think that like it's all about what we can do for God. Look at what a good person I am, God. Look at my big demonstration of faith. They say they're not earning their way to heaven, but they think so. So like it just shatters their world when they see a sinner amongst them and they don't know how to respond. So they would rather, again, if they're losing something, there's cognitive dissonance. So what do? They bargain. They say, well, maybe he's really a rapist. Maybe rape isn't that big of a deal. Maybe if we just make her make up with him, then everything will be okay. So like, what I was saying with Eli in our discussion over dinner is I think the forgiveness process is kind of akin to the grieving process. It could take years, and it's all about this redirecting of energy and accepting that things aren't going to be the same and figuring out how to constructively move on to that. But to literally act like the victim has a problem because they can't wave a wand and because they're smart enough to know that you're not supposed to hug a rapist is just messed up. Like, I agree with you.
Yeah, well, yeah, definitely. These are people that are, if the situation is real, very disconnected from, I would describe human emotion, normal human emotion and interaction. You would describe from the Spirit of God, because I don't think there's any way that works on either level. One thing. Here's another question, a little bit of a challenge. Now, I am prone to a great deal of apathy. I'm not. I don't have strong emotional reactions generally to people. I have them, but my experience is they're not as intense as other people's. And there are a few instances where I've held a grudge over the years, but much of the time when somebody has wronged me, if I don't feel particularly harmed, I honestly just don't care particularly, right? So it's very easy for me to forgive people because often I don't really hold any real animosity. So I guess the question is, for you, what do you think the difference is between forgiveness and simply being apathetic or simply not caring anymore? Does it have to be an act, a deliberate act, and does it have to be something that you sort of fight for, or is it just that sometimes you have to fight for it and sometimes you don't?
Well, again, this kind of plays into like the discussion I had with Eli. He and I think when we first started dating, we were under this impression that like we were so similar. Like, oh, you were a former debater, I was a former debater. You were homeschooled, I was homeschooled. Blah 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 blah. But when you get married to someone, you kind of realize like, holy shoot, they're so different from me. And one of the huge differences is that when he's wrong, he basically attempts to bargain in such a way that he wants to get back in the good graces of the person who hurt him. And I'm on the other end of the spectrum, and I'm just kind of like, you will pay. Thor's hammer will come down upon you. Like, that's my first impulse. So I think the difference between apathy and forgiveness. When I was in my crisis intervention class, I had to do an extra. I had a reading assignment, I think, in the bibliography, and the book I picked out was called "Forgiving Your Parents, Forgiving Yourself." The reason I picked it is after 30 years of marriage, my mom and dad split, and it was really, really messy. And I think that it was a huge radical departure from my upbringing. and I was
Hmm.
really, really angry because I felt like my dad had abandoned all of us, that he left us, and I was so mad at my mom too, like both my parents. Everything seemed like a lie. And so this book I read kind of helped myself through that, and part of that's where I get the inspiration with the whole like comparison to the grieving process. Like when you forgive, like everyone has some level of dysfunction in their family, right? Like we're all dysfunctional, some more than others. And the first step of forgiveness is realizing that there's a problem, right? What kind of distinguishes forgiveness from apathy is that when you're apathetic, you might not necessarily think there is a problem per se, right? Like you don't think it's that big of a deal. And there is an important part about
Right.
realizing that there is a problem, if only for the principle of the thing. I think that's what makes forgiveness such a hard thing. Um, Especially, I think you would fall maybe a little bit more towards Eli's end of the spectrum. Like, you're not trying to make the people who
Probably.
hurt you like you per se, but yeah, but
No,
you're not
no.
like me. You're not kind of like, you don't have like the. Well, okay, so like, if I had a.
Every once in a while I do. There are exceptions, right? But there's a few people I'm like, curse that person. 20 years ago, they
Well, I'm
wronged
not
me.
like
Yeah, yeah,
I'm
that's
not
not a
I'm
little bit
not
of that,
Catholic or
but
anything, but the whole, if I had a seven deadly sin, I'd be like Brad Pitt
yeah.
at the end of Seven, like Wrath. What's in the box? What's in the box? Because like Wrath is my
Yeah,
deal, but it's easy for me to see there's a problem, but I don't do well with the anger part of the process. So like, uh, yeah, apathy kind of ignores the whole critical part that you have to acknowledge there's a problem. And one might say that within the Christian subculture that tends to ignore sexual assault and harassment, you might say that in their own special way, they don't seem to think it's that big of a problem, or they try to bargain with it. A really good website to check out is Recovering Grace. It specifically deals with the cult culture of Bill Gothard's ATI. And there's a lot of people who talk about
mhm,
how it's usually a stepfather or a sibling, which is statistically in line with what tends to happen in these situations. It gets actually assaulted by someone in the family or the church. And when it is brought to the attention of a spiritual authority, um, well, the ATI curriculum generally tries to say like even a female child must have done something to seduce her attacker, like as young as 5 or
oh yeah,
younger. It's really messed up. I think it's just a form of bargaining, like the failure to acknowledge that there is a problem to begin with. Because if there's not a problem, right, we don't have to
right,
go through the whole process of like hurting. Um, yeah,
yeah.
I had a friend.
I had a long discussion with my wife the other day about sexual assault and sexuality and rape and things like that. Some of these topics, like for whatever reason, that day everything I talked about ended up some discussion on that subject. And I have some, I don't know, kind of unusual views. I tend to think that people want to take absolute views one way or the other. Have the absolutes on either side, and the truth is often some murky middle ground that's really hard to separate. But people will gravitate towards one side or the other. It's kind of here or there, but I thought it was worthwhile. Yeah, but so people, when it's convenient to them, will move to one side, or inconvenient will move to another. So, for instance, like some people will say, well, oh yeah, well she was, flirting with him, and therefore the rape is justified, which is like, no, 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 no. As where other people will go, no, she never flirted at all, right? It's there's no, nothing. Well, maybe she did, right? I mean, that does happen. People flirt. The real truth of the matter is, yes, people flirt. They should not get raped when flirting, right? There's kind of
Yeah,
a middle ground. Children are not always entirely sexually innocent or without sexuality, right? There is some, but as adults, we need to recognize that there's a line that you don't cross. That we set up for very specific moral reasons. It's not because children are entirely innocent, but it is because adults should be responsible and protective of them for various reasons. So that's how I tend to see things like that, and I don't know, it makes some of those debates interesting, or so or difficult for that
yeah.
reason.
There's a it's biggest band I'm a huge fan of. It's a Christian band, but it's kind of like one of those bands that rely on Cape. It's not particularly. It's not like hitting you over the head with a hammer. Christian. It's called Need to Breathe. It's super
Mhm.
awesome. And there's a song they have called Streets of Gold, where I think it kind of, you generally assume it revolves around a breakup of some sort or some old friendship that didn't work out. And the whole idea is that people are never ever going to reconcile in this life, but the hope is that, assuming they're both Christians, that maybe one day, they'll meet in heaven. And I do think that's reserved for instances where the wrong in question, like it wasn't the level. Like, if you're raping a 9-year-old and you don't want to be punished for that and you aren't repentant, I don't think anyone's going to see you in heaven. That's just fruit of the
Yeah, I would
rape is
agree.
not a fruit of the spirit, kids. Fact. But as far as the more benign wrongs that sometimes can't be reconciled for various reasons, like distance or just maybe it's like, okay, take my husband for instance. You know, he had this ex-girlfriend with this really dramatic situation where she got hit by an 18-wheeler and went into a coma, and when she woke up, she broke up with him at her parents' behest because she came from like a really conservative family. Um, they can't ever go back to the way things were, obviously, because he's married to me now. So like, life is like that. For various reasons, you can't really fully reconcile with somebody. That's why it's got to really kind of be. People don't realize forgiveness is something that's good for you. A lot of these more cult-like groups within Christianity will try to make it like they're breathing down your neck, like, have you forgiven him yet? Have you forgiven him yet? If it's supposed to be, it's supposed to be about,
Yeah,
yeah, it's our inner journey, right?
Right. Yeah, I definitely think it has to come from within. It's not something you can't force somebody to forgive and have it be meaningful, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Right. It has to be something that you're choosing to do, and making it stick. You might in some cases say I forgive you when you don't. That's for social smoothness, let's
Yeah.
say. I've done that once or twice. Right. And I'm okay with that, right? Because usually later I don't care anymore, right? So it works out in the end. But at the moment, maybe I'm just like, I want to, like somebody at work, like, no, I don't forgive you for doing that, but I'm going to, so we can move on and do something else, right?
Yeah.
Get on with things. But I think generally speaking, you can't cajole somebody into it. You can't force them into it. You can't talk them into it. It's something they have to. You can teach them about forgiveness, and you can help them understand what it would mean. But it's something that, if it means anything, it has to come from the person who's doing the forgiving.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing about Christianity. Like, there are basically 3 big parts of Christianity. You have the justification, which is the idea that when you're folded into God's family, you are justified before God, and that's the immediate forgiveness. And then there is what's called your sanctification, you conforming and becoming more like Christ, but that's a work that God is doing within you with the Holy Spirit and its regenerative nature, and it doesn't happen right away. You don't go from like super bad boy to some sort of a nun like that. It takes time. It's a process. Everything's a process, and as long as we live in a broken world, it's going to take time, which is why it's important in the terms of forgiveness to be sensitive to the needs of the victim and not try to breathe down their neck right away, and understand that it is a process for them. And then, of course, there's glorification, and that's when the Bible promises that all things will be made new, there will be no more tears, but that's a day that we look forward to in the future, and to try and act like some magic words are going to solve the issue of sexual assault is not only a misreading of basic theology in Christianity, it's absolutely dangerous, and it protects a sin that we're supposed to be helping. We're supposed to be getting rid of it. The church is supposed to be doing God's work on earth, and to actually be aiding sexual assault is a thing that I think we should be ashamed of. It's bad. We need to always be reforming ourselves from within, like Martin Luther, like John Calvin. And even John Calvin and Martin Luther weren't perfect, right? The whole idea to come out of the Protestant Reformation was always reforming, always getting better, always learning, because that's the Christian walk. So, yeah.
I'll also say, here's another topic I've got listed here. For me, some actions I would never forgive. And I don't think that I necessarily should. Now, there's that sort of, I can let go and not be obsessed about it. But even if, I feel wronged, and even if I've let go of my personal anger, I've managed to, kind of transcend it, let's say. I'm not forgiving them. Not a chance, right? I still feel what they did is terribly wrong. I still hold them responsible for it, and if I saw them, I would enact whatever vengeance or justice I thought was appropriate. This would be especially true if somebody hasn't paid for whatever their crime is. And I wouldn't forgive them. I wouldn't go out of my way to seek them, but I wouldn't offer them that, or in my heart they would still be checked up as the evil people I want nothing to do with, right? And would oppose whenever possible. I don't know, I know there's some Christians who feel the same way, which is why I understand some of them, even though the Bible, Jesus teaches a very strong measure of forgiveness for your enemies and letting go of your animosity and hatred. I can understand why some people don't, because I don't. That's one of those, I don't take it as far as Jesus does in some cases. Most minor affronts, if I'm not seriously harmed, but when people are absolutely, when my opinion, evil and predatory and dangerous to others, I actually have no forgiveness for them, nor feel like it would be necessarily a good thing for me to enact it, because it's not hurting me. I don't, like I said, I can transcend feelings of anger and come to a place that's calm and engage in other activities to take my mind off whatever it is. I don't obsess much, but I still don't forgive them. I wouldn't give them that extra measure, because I think that has to come from me letting go of the harm that they've done, and I won't.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it kind of comes down to like what you believe forgiveness to mean. If forgiveness to you means reconciliation included, which I don't think from a Christian perspective it should necessarily mean reconciliation. But if you think it has to include reconciliation, I would understand why you would say you haven't forgiven them. I did talk about that kind of earlier, how we are told to not put God to the test. We're not supposed to be reckless. And I have some personal experience with this. It's always in high school, isn't it? Seemingly, this is another person.
We learn a lot in high school. Generally,
we do.
We first encounter.
I had this friend in high school, and basically, this person hurt me a lot. Like, I had invested so much time and given so much out of my heart for this person, and it was kind of really shocking. But as sometimes you do in a Christian community, this person began to go around and tell everyone but me that she was going to ask for my forgiveness or apologize, which is like, great, you just go tell everyone before me. But the deal was, I didn't want to be friends with this person. I didn't want to reconcile with her. So, long story short, I was a debate tournament in high school, and I was assigned to be the timer in that round. So, as I'm timing her round, I write on the back of the timer sheet, "I forgive you," and that means that, like, I'm not gonna come knocking down your door trying to, like, make you pay, but I don't trust you, and I don't have to trust you, because it doesn't mean I have to forget what you did. So you understand this. I might forgive you, but you should stay away from me. Don't talk to me. And I think Christians really do not do good with. We're not that great with boundaries. Again, I think a theological misreading. I definitely relate to where you say you are in terms of people. There are people in my mind where it's like, I don't have any personal anger towards them anymore, but I would have nothing to do with them because they're some shady people. And
yeah, you have no trust. Yeah, there's no trust and no.
Yeah.
Which may be an entirely different thing. That's kind of what I'm trying to explore, because and just in a sense, like if I knew, if I met Pol Pot, I would not forgive him, right? I would be like, I'm going to enact some righteous punishment upon you. That's what I'm going to do, because I think you're straight up evil. And I wouldn't feel terribly bad about it either, right? I would feel like I'm doing something just, but I don't have a religious thing. But I really do feel like, not absolutely, but I think there's an element to reconciliation, of forgiveness, at least on a personal level. I mean, for instance, if we're going to talk about Jesus a little bit, he died for sins so that we could be forgiven for them, and absolution of our punishment, right? So that forgiveness comes with absolution. It comes with reconciliation, so long as we're willing to accept it, right? If we aren't willing to accept it, you don't get it. But if you're willing to accept, then you get it, and it does come with freedom from punishment, or at least in theory, right? So I don't know. I feel like there's always got to be an element there. Maybe it's flexible, right? There's some degree to it.
I think the key word you're looking for is degenerate versus regenerate. So it's not just like, and this is the problem with some soteriology in Baptist circles or Pentecostal circles, the whole emphasis on the acceptance part, where it's like, yeah, my salvation's like a suitcase that I can pick up, and I can also drop it anytime I want. But what really, really does happen when you are saved according to Christian theology is the Holy Spirit comes within you and it regenerates you. It takes a hardened heart and it's fighting back against sin. You are, in fact, the changed person. It doesn't mean that you're perfect, but it means that whatever was at the core of your being has been changed and oriented towards godly things, and you have now started your journey in the right direction. So I think church discipline is a really good example. So I know this is not that common in Protestant churches, but some Reformed Protestant churches tend to excommunicate. Not like the Catholics excommunicate, not like, you're going to burn you at the stake. But the basic process is, okay, if someone does something wrong to someone in a church that doesn't amount to the level of like law enforcement, first the person who was assuming that they are it's an adult and an adult, you confront the person who wronged you. If they don't listen or acknowledge, you go with a brother in Christ, sister in Christ, and do it together. If still they deny it, you go to the elders, who are the ruling body of the church, and they confront the person. And finally, if the person is sinning and it's been determined that, and they're not listening to any reason, at that point, the epistles say to treat them as one who is not saved. And what that basically means is to say, if you were regenerate, even if you say you're a Christian, if you were regenerate, the fruit of the Spirit, the evidence of that salvation would be there, and you wouldn't be sinning unrepentantly towards another person. So you don't get to act like you're a Christian. Like, you don't get to be in the club if you're not going to play by the club's rules, because clearly you don't care about, what we're about. So the whole idea, is to kind of like, if someone is degenerate, particularly to the point that they are dangerous to you, you can forgive them, but forgiving them, understanding that they are kind of operating from the wrong plane. Like, you realize the grace of Christ is not within this person, so they're just doing what will come naturally to them in a fallen world. They're being sometimes even predatory. So I need to not trust them entirely, right? If this person is continually hurting other people, then he's not one of us. He's, as the epistles would say, he's a wolf in sheep's clothing, a wolf in the flock. And that's another thing that really, like, self-protection, right? These cult-like churches, it's almost like they've forgotten that there are people all the time who worm their way into churches and they're complete predators. Like, they're not there for the love of Christ.
Well, I think that's because the people who lead these cults are those people.
Oh, right? Yeah, definitely.
That would be my general consensus on those, but I don't know. It could be different than that, but I think that's usually what happens.
Yeah, I like to joke sometimes that, like, Baptist and Pentecostal churches with their church structure, it's like the pastor is the mini pope. Just like no accountability.
Oh, yeah.
No nothing at all. He just decides everything, and that's really problematic, and power corrupts.
Yeah, and not in keeping with Protestant tradition at all, right? Like, or at least its origins and ideals. So yeah, I think
it's a problem, like, especially within. I think really this problem, like the whole church too thing. Like, there's a huge scandal with Catholic priests, and I think with any denomination, like, it's a sin problem. It's going to be everywhere. But I think the particular denomination, at least in America, that has this huge problem is the Baptist Evangelical Church, because they've gone so far out of their roots in terms of not only just forgiveness and soteriology, but the proper discipline to deal with people when they step out of line. Because that's another thing, church discipline, right? We have it instituted within our visible body to deal with people who are sinning and won't stop. So it's pretty clear from that alone that you're not supposed to turn the other way when there's unrepentant sin. You're supposed to do something about it. And it just really bothers me. I'm a socially conservative person, but especially since in the past few years, I've been realizing within my own circle of people, there's just a lot of people who don't take sexual assault seriously at all. And that's not really within the, that's not the gospel that I know, that I thought everyone knew. So I think it's really critical for Christians to, when they hear stuff about sexual assault, when they hear stuff about forgiveness, they need to make sure that they're actually in touch with the doctrine and they're not just going off of some sort of cultural saying.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's a lot of it. So let's see. I've got a final question for you, sort of a theological one. Semi-theological, I guess, because it asks you to speculate about things you couldn't necessarily know. Why do you think Jesus teaches teachings like to turn the other cheek and to love thy enemy? What do you think the purpose of that is?
Ultimately, I think that's a recognition of God's sovereignty in our lives. The fact of the matter is, like, we should turn the other cheek, but there's a point where you're out of cheeks left to slap, right? That's what I like to say. We should be gracious towards people, but we shouldn't be stupid. I think that there's a line there, because we should do things in faith, and we should forgive, and we should try to emulate God. But remember, Jesus did not deliberately put himself in a dangerous situation. He didn't throw himself off the temple top at Satan's behest just because he knew the angels would catch him. Like,
Well, he walked into his own crucifixion, right? I mean, there's that.
He did that, but that's why he was sent there, and he wasn't doing it just to show off. He actually had a deliberate purpose, and not to mention the fact that like it wasn't just a show off move. Like I'm gonna do something reckless, and God is gonna, he's got me. It was
Oh,
a matter
yeah,
of like an actual purpose related to his mission on Earth. But yeah.
Okay, well, we're about 8 seconds, so I'll just say thanks
Oh,
very
you
much for
too.
taking up this debate. I hope people enjoyed it.
Yeah.
All right.